if you come in and settle down, and for the lighting people, I wonder if you could do something about those lights, because I can't see anybody out there. Thank you. Well, a very good morning again to everybody. This is a session that is meant to focus on research universities, partnering industries and governments for economic growth. Let me first introduce myself. My name is Lily Kong. I'm provost of the Singapore Management University and formerly from the National University of Singapore, so this feels a little bit like a homecoming. I'm delighted this morning to have with us a very distinguished panel, and I will introduce them very briefly. I was jokingly saying a moment ago in the speaker's room that if I were to do full justice to these individuals, we'll be here for more than the hour. So very quickly, I'll just begin in the order that we are seated. To my right, to the utmost right, is Robert Morris, who is a professor at the Yong School of Medicine at NUS and former head of Global Laboratories, IBM Research. He actually spends a lot of his time now with Singapore's Ministry of Health and has an advisory role at the National Research Foundation in the Prime Minister's office. There's a lot more that I could say about each individual, but I'm going to keep it very brief because in a moment I'm going to invite them to say a little bit of what it is they do that contributes to this topic. So I'll let them do the elaboration. To my immediate right is a good friend of mine, and we happen to share the same name. Lily Chan is Chief Executive Officer of NUS Enterprise here at NUS. And Lily has very ably led NUS Enterprise for many years now, where she spearheads strategies and initiatives to promote industry collaboration and business ventures involving the university's students, staff, and alumni. To my left, immediate left, is Bernd Huber, president of LMU Munich, and he's held this role since the year 2002. LMU, many of you will know, is a wonderful university in the heart of Munich, and this, in fact, the second largest university in Germany, and there's about 51,000 students. So as we were chatting this morning and I was sharing the numbers at SMU of about 10,000 students, it's a different order of magnitude. To my extreme left is Stephen Toope. Professor Toope is vice-chancellor of the University of Cambridge. And prior to joining Cambridge in 2017, he was at the University of Toronto, and before that he was president and vice-chancellor of the University of British Columbia. Just in terms of this very brief introduction, you already see the depth of experience and knowledge that we have on this particular panel, but there's much more. And I'm actually going to begin in the next moment by inviting each of them to say a little bit about their work, past and present, that contributes to how research universities contribute by partnering industries and governments for economic growth. This is a topic that I think interests many of us in the room. Universities are not sort of ivory towers unto themselves, although we sometimes still get described in that manner. But in fact, a lot of what we do does contribute not just to industry, but more broadly to business, government, and society. And this is something that at SMU we believe very firmly is. Located as we are in the heart of the city, we spend a lot of our time thinking about and contributing to the life of the city, both in terms of the economic dimensions, but also the social dimensions. And in the education that we put together, we try to integrate our students into the warp and woof of the city as well. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to moderate this session because it's a topic that's very close to my heart and something that we think about daily and work on all the time. So if I may, I'd just like to turn to each of the panelists, and I'll again start to my extreme right, and invite Robert to say a little bit in a couple of minutes about the work that you've done and how, through your institutional work, you have sought to forge those partnerships between industries, governments, and universities.
Okay, thank you, Lily. And it's great to be on this panel. I've spent many, many years working on these government, university, industry problems, but always really from the industry side. I've spent almost my entire life in industry at Bell Labs and IBM Research. And just within the last year, less than 1 year ago, I took up an academic and government appointment, which is just amazing to me to be able to look at things from the other side. So I'm really going to enjoy hearing the views of others on the panel here. And I've also, during that time, kicked around with a lot of government labs and companies, other companies, and also universities, and been involved with quite a few boards and organizations like the Government University Industry Research Roundtable run by the National Academies in the United States, and also the Bay Area Science and Innovation Consortium in the Silicon Valley. And we tried to solve some of these problems. And the problems, you know, in the past were always quite easy to put your finger on. There are problems about funding, and funding is purported to change money into ideas. And the other thing that seemed to often occupy our mind and actually be a stumbling block was intellectual property, which is about turning ideas back into money. And I'd love to say that this circle was a virtuous circle or an efficient cycle like the energy cycle or the cell cycle, but it actually does have a lot of friction and problems that we have, I think, partially solved in some ways, and the problems have also changed over the years. I think the problems today that we face in making government, university, and industry work well together are somewhat different than they were about 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I'm sure we'll get into some of that on this panel. So,
I would
thank you.
love to hear that discussion go ahead later. Lily, from your perspective of having worked at EDB and so forth, and now in a university context, would you introduce a little bit of what you've done?
So in the past, I think I'm one of the few people in Singapore who's gone from industry, startup industry in the biotech industry. When I first finished my PhD, I didn't know what startups were. So it's great, you go in there. And then after 9 years of that, I was then asked to go into the government, and this was the EDB, where we manage an investment fund for biotech investments. And then 12 years ago, I was approached by Cho Chuan, now that you know industry, you know government, can you now come and work for the university on the academic side? So my role was really to look at industry collaborations, to look at IP, to look at how faculty can spin off companies, but at the same time, can we get a culture on campus that is entrepreneurial? So all these things were going on in parallel, and it was a bet in the early years at NUS, which one would take off first. And sure enough, it's the undergraduates who started to form the companies. And I think yesterday, our president, Ing Chai, mentioned that we now have, at any one time, 100 to 200, we lose count, around the campus, and a whole ecosystem that we gentrified across from the campus, an area set for demolition, but we gentrified it. Demolition never happened. It is now one of the largest startup communities in Singapore. So that's what I've done.
Wonderful, thank you. It wasn't intentional that I had much more of the sort of mixed experience on this side and the university experience on this side. Wasn't intended at all. But I might now turn to President of LMU to say a little bit from a university perspective and what you do.
I have no perspective on industry. I've always worked all my life at the university, therefore must be a little bit careful in many respects. First thing I would like to mention is, if I consider the activities of my universities, that we are entrepreneurs ourselves. We are running one of the largest hospitals in Europe with 10,000 employees, therefore have a lot of experience. Within our university, we have a lot of centers, for example, an entrepreneurship center for spin-off startup activities at the university. We work together, we cooperate with many matchmakers like Fraunhofer. And of course in Munich you have a situation where you have a hub with many flourishing business. For example, we have BMW, we have Siemens, we have Munich Re, we have a very active startup scene in Munich, and all this means that Munich is a kind of hub for the interaction between business, universities, and the government. It's also an important addition that the government in Germany tries to invest in science, in research, to make this a key factor in the growth process and the future growth of the German economy.
Thank you. I think Munich is such an active hive of startup activity. It's amazing to see. I might turn then to Stephen, Cambridge. Would you like to introduce a little bit of what you do?
Well, I think by way of context, by most calculations, the Cambridge cluster, as it's now called, is probably the third cluster in the world for high-tech engagement. So there are roughly 4,700 companies in the Cambridge area, employing roughly 60,000 people, turnover 13.9 billion pounds last year, 13 unicorns, plus billion-dollar companies created in that ecosystem over the course of the last 20 to 30 years. So it's an astonishing achievement, and it's not due only to the university, but I think the university's existence has been the magnet around most of which this has been built. And of course, why does it matter? I think it's important to say that it's because of the fundamental quality of the research. Good for us to remember as university leaders that that's our value add in many ways, is the basic research and the applied research that's done in the university. And that means we have to pay attention to the quality of people, right from the senior professorial leadership to the research endeavor, postdocs, et cetera, right down to doctoral students. Obviously, we have all of the standard accoutrements of what now exists to try to have a robust infrastructure, a robust ecosystem. I won't talk about that, but I want to say two other things. First, we've had in existence for about 12 years something called Cambridge Enterprise. Many universities will have those sorts of organizations. What I want to say is they're never perfect. They always have problems, and one of the things as a university leader is that I'm constantly getting complaints about various elements of how our tech transfer operation works and whether it's as responsive as it needs to be, is it as open-spirited as it needs to be. The answer is no, 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 but we're trying, and the proof's in the pudding. It actually works pretty darn well. So I think we have to, as university leaders, accept the critique, try to do better, but also have a certain sang-froid and not get panicky when we have complaints. The last thing I want to say, and it was really emphasized by Brian Schmidt yesterday, I think one of the keys to success is not to get hung up on licensing income from the perspective of the university. That's not where the big benefit is. The big benefit, as Brian emphasized, is in ensuring that you're seen to be part of a healthy ecosystem, that you're helping to drive it, working both with industry and government, and we'll say more about that, and that you're not there to get the short-term gain. And that implies as well that in the kind of service mentality we have to be thinking very creatively about how to help management be developed for the startups and the scale-ups. In my experience, that may be the single greatest challenge to really developing an exciting ecosystem, is a lack of management skill. So that's another area where universities have a very particular role to play, and we're trying to do that through our Judge Business School and other components.
Wonderful, thank you. We just have the hour, and it's now down to 41 minutes, and I'd like for this to be a conversation more than individual sort of monologues as such. So I'm going to begin by posing a few questions to our panelists, and I'll invite a particular panelist to take a lead with the discussion, but I'd like to see the conversation across the panel and also the conversation with the audience. So very quickly, let me just jump into this. I'd like to begin at the end. And what do I mean by that? We have a panel that's titled Research Universities, Partnering Industries and Governments for Economic Growth. And the assumption is that really research universities have a place in contributing to the economic growth and more generally the societal development of the community and society that we're a part of. So the first question I have, just to get the conversation going, is how does each institution demonstrate its contribution to economic growth, and how do we assess that? So it's entirely possible to say as universities, we're getting the research grants in, we're doing all this research, etc., and it's somehow contributing to economic growth. But the question that's very often asked of universities is, how do you tangibly demonstrate that? What are your measures of that? And recognizing that those measures can sometimes be reductionistic, can sometimes be one-dimensional, single-dimensional. How do we as universities, in the first instance, respond to those questions about what is our value in contributing to economic and societal growth? I'm going to begin by directing that question to Stephen, but welcome other comments as well.
Well, perhaps provocatively, I'll start by saying it is not our primary purpose as an institution to drive economic growth, and I think it's important to say that. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have a role to play, and the answer to your question then is obviously the very fact that we produce the leaders and the outstanding scientists and the outstanding professionals, the outstanding political leaders for our societies is in and of itself a contribution, I think, to economic growth. But our contribution, as I tried to suggest earlier, starts with fundamentally doing good research and good teaching. And if we do that and then collaborate with local industry, as I tried to suggest is certainly happening in the Cambridge cluster, and global industry for that matter, and try to figure out how we can play a role working with especially local authorities in delivering economic planning, which is something Cambridge does very actively in partnership with local authorities. I think that's how ultimately we produce economic growth. It is through our partnerships and as an extension of our work. It's not the core of our work.
Thank you. Would you like to comment on that?
I would also argue basic research is a key issue, of course, at universities, and our major objective is to make excellent research and blue sky research, and it's extremely difficult in economic terms to measure a direct impact of basic research. Therefore, some of the benefits may be difficult to measure in many respects, and nonetheless they are present. In addition, I would also say that the tasks of the universities are broader, even if you consider societal impact. For example, you affect cultural discussions, public discussions, many debates. Just to mention an example, at our university, we are organizing events with writers like Knausgard and many others who offer lectures at our university. That's a small task, but it's also important that university plays this role in many respects.
Right. So we have the university view that, in a certain sense, our roles are much more primary and fundamental. And of course, it doesn't mean that there aren't the positive outcomes and impacts on economic growth, but that's not the starting point as such. I'd love to hear the audience reaction to that, particularly those who might be from government agencies and the government sector. But let me turn to Lily and ask the same question, because your role has been very precisely to help address how the university contributes to the economic growth of the country.
So I think we are very fortunate in Singapore. We have a government that really tries to support the universities, and obviously we constantly get pressure from the top. But at the same time, I think economic growth can be measured through, as what Stephen has said, through industry collaborations, doing very good research, and then having corporate relationships. So we have a lot of, I would say that there is funding in Singapore for corporates to work with university researchers in multidisciplinary research. For instance, cybersecurity. We've got many factions from consortiums in industry who are not in the cybersecurity area but want to know about cybersecurity. So we've got consortiums on that. We've got collaborations with our largest telco company in Singapore and around the region, Singtel, on cybersecurity corporate research. But interestingly, one aspect that we've not really looked at and which we're starting to think about and starting to see some progress in there is the startup ecosystem or spin-off ecosystem that is around the campus. By mere fact that there are startups and spin-offs around the campus would start to attract corporations into the community. And as they come into the community, they understand what these startups are offering, what some of these young companies may not also know that what they have may be of use to various corporations. At the same time, the corporations would be able to look into the university. So think about a dynamic ecosystem that is on young companies around the campus, faculty research, good research, and then corporations coming on their own. In the early days, it was very hard. I had to go knock on doors, and then you're like selling a toolbox. You know, we've got this for licensing, we've got that for licensing. So you've got to be able to build it up so that there is a dynamic ecosystem around that even government agencies, you know, hospitals, Ministry of Health, the Port Authority are now coming into this ecosystem trying to figure out. And at the end of it, we hope that there's economic growth for everyone around. But it's not just Singapore. We hope to be able to work with the countries around Singapore in their ecosystem so that we can bring, for instance, Singtel into Indonesia to see if they can leverage on partner universities' technologies. So this is something that we are trying to do, and I think this is one way of looking at it.
Robert, your very interesting background with industry and, you know, now in university but also government, I'd love to hear your contributions to this dialogue that we started.
Yeah, so I'd just like to build off, I think, the three last comments that have been made, which I think are quite interesting in that this is a very different conversation than one that we would have been having, even with the top universities in the world 10 or 15 years ago. And the big shift is the university, and Stephen said it first, the universities have come off this point that we have this research and all you need to do is license it for us and all these wonderful things will happen. And they've become much more sophisticated, realizing the research is very important. It's a seed. Sometimes it's an essential seed, but it's only a small part of the whole equation. And that the right way to do research and to, in fact, have economic impact and, in fact, have your research have more impact is to become part of an ecosystem or part of what we were trying to push for those who didn't see it 10 or 15 years ago, was an open, collaborative environment. To publish as much of the IP and not try to keep it as licensable goods. So I think that's been huge progress. I think the top universities have all woken up to that. And there's an interesting effect here. When the top universities open up to that, the not so top tier universities, it's not as easy for them because, of course, not everyone necessarily wants to collaborate as much with them, but they really have to come along with it and they have to realize that it is a collaborative enterprise. The other part of it is a key part of that collaboration, again, is not the licensing of a piece of intellectual property. It's about the movement of people. And this, I think, is a great thing because it's gone back to the university and it's put a huge emphasis on the university as a teacher and a trainer, not just in a technical or scientific or professional discipline, but in a broader sense. And that's been extremely positive that that's happened. I think Prof. Ben Israel probably put it better than I've ever heard it in his previous talk. He said, basically, if I can paraphrase him, he said, there is no technology transfer, just transfer of technologists, right? And that should be true in both directions. We should have certainly students graduating and flowing out from universities, but we need this back and forwards pattern as really the only way to cross-fertilize the government, university, and industry programs. We need more and more of that. Where that's been done, that's worked extremely well. So I think we can see us all moving forward. I think while that's happened, there have been other challenges that have come forward, and maybe we'll come to those later. Fresh challenges that we haven't dealt with yet.
Can I just make a quick comment? I think in the early days, Even in Singapore, we're asked, how many patents do you have?
Right.
How many are licensed? What is your industry revenue? Being really out of the box, I said, well, you tell me. If you want 100, we'll produce 100. But where is the economic impact? What is the impact we're trying to produce? So I think as universities, we need to look at multiple aspects of it and not just measure it by how many patents, how many get licensed, what is the industry revenue. I think it just, once you chase those numbers, it really defeats the purpose of what university ecosystems are all about.
So there is a common thread in some of what's just been said in the last 5 to 10 minutes, which is that the university is about fundamental research first and foremost. And what comes out of that, if it's helpful to economic growth, and it will, some research will have that effect, but that's not the starting point. And the measurement of that is really not in the patents and the licensing and so forth. And there is a question that has come that's related to this, a question that's come from the audience, and I'd like to just read that question to you and invite the panel's reactions. And the question is, how big is the risk that fundamental research slowly shifts into subcontracted, directed research to suit specific corporate needs? Because of this whole thing about we need to contribute to economic growth and so forth, that we end up being doing very much contracted research. I'd like to invite reactions to that. Who would like to go first?
I do not
Bernd.
see this risk actually. It's always difficult to distinguish between basic and applied research, and these distinctions in many respects blurred. But I think many research activities at universities are what I as an economist would always call public goods, and they will not be financed by companies. There are clearly areas of research which can be financed by corporations. But if you consider a topic like quantum physics, if you consider basic research in the life sciences, this is not an activity which will be typically be undertaken or financed by corporations. Therefore, I think that's basically a task for funding by governments, of course, and foundations and other issues. Therefore, I do not see this risk, and it's also not entirely clear whether it's really a risk, because there are research activities which can be financed by the government. In Germany, we have a very successful model. That's the so-called Fraunhofer organization, which is funded, if I remember the numbers exactly, by 80% by private funding, companies, and 20% by government funding. And this is a good opportunity to do this kind of contractual research, which is needed by companies, which they do not undertake themselves, and on the other hand, academic abilities. Therefore.
Like Bernd, I don't really see this as a fundamental challenge, and the reason for that is I have a lot of confidence in my colleagues. There are a lot of colleagues who have absolutely no interest in doing anything that would feel like it is just being targeted towards a specific company's desires, the kinds of research that Bernd has already talked about. But I would also say I have colleagues who are fascinated by trying to improve processes, trying to contribute. We've had on the campus at Cambridge for more than 50 years the Whittle Lab, named after one of the creators of the jet engine, and that's entirely funded or strongly funded by Rolls-Royce. And there's been a fabulous collaborative relationship for all of that time. Some basic research, some more targeted research, and different professors have different interests. And so I see this as being a way of ensuring that we always retain the fundamental commitment to blue skies research, and for other people in certain disciplines, the ability to feel that their research is having a very particular impact now. People are motivated differently, and we should celebrate that.
Maybe I'd like to broaden the question out a little bit to not just research in universities, but research in any lab, whether it's a commercial lab or the amount of research that a smaller company can afford to do, or a government lab. And it's very important to keep a portfolio model of research, which means doing some things which actually could be commercialized. Something, well, maybe at the far end of the spectrum, some things that you want to commercialize, then some things that could be commercialized, and some things that you have no idea if they're ever going to be if they could ever be commercialized, but maybe if they could, they would have huge impact, right? You have to actually manage this portfolio. And I have no doubt that this is self-regulating in a great or very top-tier university, that will be managed. They have an oversupply of very generous funding from various private and public donation, et cetera. They have no trouble getting research funding. I think it's the next 1,000 universities that have to be careful, or 1,000 labs, that have to be careful managing that portfolio and making sure that it doesn't, tends to actually bubble up in the middle of doing things that are not quite product but not quite basic research. And it gets out of whack where you're not doing very applied things and you're not doing very basic things. So that portfolio management is very important. Once you start to do that, very interesting thing starts to happen. Some people, you find some of your very top and most impactful researchers seems to be able to function throughout the portfolio. They're very abstract, they do very abstract work, and on the other hand, their ideas turn out to be extremely important practically and commercially. And I think all universities need to aspire to that kind of a portfolio management model. Actually, all research organizations need to aspire to that kind of a portfolio management. And they need to constantly look at it and constantly say, are we falling into a trap at one end or other end of the spectrum?
Thank you. This is a good segue into talking about the kinds of challenges I think that universities, industries, and government agencies have in working together in various forms of collaborations, and how do we overcome some of these challenges to achieve a healthy ecosystem as such? And I wonder whether, Robert, you'd like to start that discussion.
Yeah, I think there are, and I just kind of alluded to this at the beginning and left you in suspense. I think we've gotten over some of the problems of 10 or 15 years ago, and these new problems have emerged, and they haven't been solved yet. And what are these new problems? And I may be speaking to this a little bit with somewhat of a commercial bent, but if you haven't noticed, there's actually a tremendous concentration that's occurring within industry, whether it's in, and it's pretty much across many, particularly in technology. There's concentration to a few major players that seem to be getting more and more control. And actually not just in technology, but in other fields as well. We're starting to see this concentration. It's not too dissimilar to the Gini coefficient effect that you have. Once you have the money and you can invest and you have network effects, et cetera, you become more and more powerful. So this concentration is a very notable effect. And then something else that maybe seems unrelated has been happening. And it's just remarkable. It's unbelievable what's happened. And if you predicted it 15 years ago, no one would ever have believed you that this would happen. And that is the open source movement. The fact that so much fantastic software technology, and let's face it, so many innovations are now instantiated in software, the language of computing, right? Have now become open source. Just last couple of weeks, I've been installing a big data AI cluster with accelerators and everything. I didn't have to put out a single purchase order. Almost everything I need, including the most advanced machine learning, AI, natural language, accelerator software, it's all available off the web for nothing. Didn't have to buy a single piece of software. How could this possibly happen when you have these gigantic software organizations and pretty much people in all aspects of the industry? They're realizing now that if they're doing something important, they should donate it to open source. So blockchain, all the source code for blockchain's been donated to open source. All the best software for machine learning has now been donated to open source. This is an amazing effect. So two apparently disconnected things, concentration and open source. But there's a dark side of this concentration effect. And what is it? Everyone who works in AI, et cetera, knows that your whole lifeblood of being able to do research depends on being able to get the data. And there's a lot of very good researchers I'm very aware of being in healthcare now that cannot get the data to do their work on healthcare. The hospitals can't release it because they're scared of privacy issues, et cetera. Some organizations won't release it because they think it's an economic advantage to hold on to it. It's their lifeblood, et cetera. And so something bad is happening, and data's all being kind of sucked up and controlled by a relatively small number of players. Well, if open source worked, maybe it's a lot to ask, but why couldn't open data work? Open data actually has a movement that's been getting going. It's actually making a lot of progress. It's still small, but the EU was very, very innovative in passing open data laws around fintech. Some of you may have noticed, if you're a fintech startup now, you have to actually make data available. And so other people, fintechs can start business, they can actually serve your clients, etc. This is very powerful. A new law passed at the end of the Obama administration, right at the last minute, called the 21st Century Cures Act. The government of the United States had been trying for years and saying, we want you to share your data between insurance companies and different healthcare systems, etc., so we can do research and we can find out, does aspirin help or does aspirin not help? We just found out from big data that actually the risks outweigh the benefits, right? Quite an amazing result, right? So, and real world, and they have basically now, although they were encouraging it for years, it wasn't really happening. So the US government has now passed laws which says you must share the data and we will prosecute you if you unreasonably withhold the sharing of data. And this is going to breathe life into the real world evidence movement, which is something that can really create huge breakthroughs in healthcare. So it's happening. And so we have to encourage this, and it's something for universities to do. Universities are in a great position to change how they publish, to publish the data that goes with their experiments. Some people are starting to do it, but it's by no means widespread. Many are holding on to their data as a secret weapon. So there are many people now that can participate in this. This is the way that we will fight against the concentration. We need to open up data and we need to make this available for researchers. Very important effect. So these are just a couple of things that I see going on from my perspective. I'd be very interested in the other panelists' views on these points.
Can I
Would you like to speak to that?
Just from a very hypothetical standpoint, what I'd love to see one day, Singapore and the region. How do the governments work together? How do corporations work together? And how can we leverage, or how can countries, our neighboring countries and partner universities in the region leverage on the connections that NUS already has in Cambridge and other places? Just think about it. Maybe there is an agricultural challenge, and this is totally hypothetical, right? The use of sensors, the use of data to take a look at what's happening out in the field. If there is a challenge there, can we work together to come up with that challenge? Work together as an ASEAN group to bring that challenge up and open it up to the partners of NUS, the partners of NTU, the partners of SMU that can reach into the other universities outside of this region. So that jointly, I mean, the vision is, can we solve a challenge? Doesn't have to be global, can be a small localized challenge, but utilizing expertise and technologies from all the partnerships that all of us have. I mean, that would be one way to look at how it's more opportunistic, how governments, how universities together, how corporations in the region can pull together something that we can all solve together.
In a sense, I think, Lily, you're addressing two questions that did appear on the screen, and I'm going to sort of say what those questions were. One, I think, from Brian was about how, universities in more isolated areas that are not plugged into these ecosystems may have greater challenges achieving some of the things that we're talking about here, and how might that be overcome? And I think, Lily, you're actually speaking to that a bit. There was another question about how the universities represented on this panel are from, sort of wealthy universities and regions, etc. And what about the universities in more left behind regions? And I think Lily's comment speaks to some of that. I'm not sure whether there are microphones in the room that allow for dialogue as opposed to just kind of me reading questions off the screen. Yes, there are microphones. So if any of you have, a comment or in response to what is being discussed, please just raise your hands. And there is one right in front already on this topic, perhaps. If we could speak to this particular thread of the conversation. Yes, please.
doesn't.
While you're looking for your question or gathering your thoughts, right in front here, please.
Thank you. Being a veteran in the area of entrepreneurship for many, many years, one of the thorny issues that you didn't touch is the issue of IP. You all nod with your head, and the larger the company, the more difficult it is to reach a university cooperation agreement about IP. And I wonder how you deal with it in your own place. Dealing with a company like Intel, Microsoft, Samsung, sometimes take 2 years regarding IP. And most of these companies ignore the fact that universities accumulate knowledge, human capital for many, many years just to reach the point that they start the negotiations. So I wonder, what is your opinion about it?
But I think that's the answer.
Yeah.
Well, Stephen has already mentioned this before. There are a lot of complaints concerning how much time it takes to negotiate this. It's the same at my university. We have very good lawyers, and they are very patient, and
Not only good lawyers,
therefore,
many lawyers.
And it takes many lawyers, and it takes time and time and time, and at a certain point, suddenly an agreement can be signed, and you wonder that there was still any negotiations because it was such a long time ago when you have heard of it. That's true, but these are the practical problems of cooperation between industry and business and universities on the other side, because there are also the interests are not entirely parallel. For example, the scientists want to publish fast, rather quickly, while industry is often interested to put the results on the side, so to say. Therefore, these are the typical conflicts. But if you have contracts between universities, we also have it takes time to negotiate. The same if you consider companies, they also need time if they do contracts. Therefore, that's part of life. Do not worry too much about this.
Lily, could I just?
Please.
It's a constant conversation. I must admit, I've been a vice-chancellor in another setting, and it was every year the same conversation. I have come to the conclusion that we just have to live with the complexity because the interests are not aligned. And the reason I say that is I think it's a big waste of time to try to imagine what the perfect IP policy is. I think we can argue about that forever. Yeah. And in fact, I mean, even within Israel, where I've gone and looked at IP policy, different institutions historically have had different IP policies, Technion versus the Weizmann, obviously different areas of work, totally different policies, both hugely effective at transfer. So I think we just have to understand that this is going to be one of the areas where there's constant irritation and not imagine that there's a perfect policy out there.
Yeah, but I would like to go further. My view on IP, but in a very broad industry, in the ICT industry, you should just say no. Everything we do together you'll save 6 to 12 months in the negotiation. Everything we do together will be open, publishable, will be published, etc. Just say no. Now, I don't say this is true for every industry. I know there are some molecules in pharmaceutical that have a slightly different logic, but for the majority of what's being generated today, you can just say no and make all the IP open. And let's face it, most software patents are a waste of time. Waste of time and money, right? Those algorithms, those software techniques, you can always work around them. People end up measuring heights of patents. We have this many patents. Oh, no, we have this many patents, right? Most of the patents are useless. There are very few controlling patents, and you get into these ridiculous, portfolio exchange models and compensation models, and it slows down professors and serious researchers in working together. So in most cases, just stop it, right? And by the way, if that university doesn't want to work with you, go to the next one and they will. That's what I found in industry. And by the way, as it turns out, the top universities will work with you on most fields with an open agreement so they can get started and so they can get stuff done.
Yes.
sorry, I was stuck, but now I've reminded my question. I'm from China, we have very complicated views about IP protection. On one hand, it's the core theme in the argument between the U.S. government and the Chinese government, the trade conflicts, all centered about the IP protection. President Trump, criticized about it. China, and on the other hand, the free flow of knowledge and technology will truly develop the developing country like China, and it will it will improve the life of common people. So, do you have any suggestions or comments about how do we get a better world from the perspective of Chinese universities? Because university, yeah.
Yes.
Well, look, I think it may be implicit in a lot of what I've already said that I think we spend too much time thinking about IP, period. But on China, interestingly enough, earlier this year I was at the China Development Forum, and I had a small group of us had a meeting with the premier, Chinese premier, and it was fascinating to me that his key theme, and there were a number of leading CEOs from major world corporations there, his key theme was IP protection for whatever reason. There was some, obviously, belief that this was fundamental for the future of collaboration. So all I can say is it seems that at least for a period, the Chinese government has now decided that that's the tack to take, which is we will try to do a better job in protecting IP. Whether or not that's right or wrong, I leave to you to decide. I was quite struck by it. He repeated it at least 3 times. And right at the end of the conversation, he said to a CEO from a very leading American global IT company, if you know of any place where your IP is being stolen, you come and talk to me directly and we'll sort it out. So that seems to be where the Chinese government is right now.
Well, there are many forms of IP, and in fact, in many cases, we're talking about patent licenses, and I'm saying those are a lot less important. There are other aspects, copyright, respective people's copyrights, and outright theft of software, right? And China I've lived and worked in China. China is trying to change the regime and be a better citizen, and I think the government is doing appropriate things there. Be a better citizen so their companies, for example, not long ago in China, if you wanted to do business with large corporations and you wanted to put your software into the banks, you had to provide all the source code, right? This is an unreasonable demand, and of course companies very much need these commercial revenues. So China is pulling back on that, and I think that's a good thing, but that's a particular issue that was present in China that certain entities in China were able to force through by virtue of their size and growth factors, that I think we shouldn't misread that or overread that in terms of how university and industry work together. For university and the industry, as far as possible, let's be open with our research. Let's even publish the code. There's a difference between that and asking a company who then transfers that into something that's 100 times bigger, that does all the operations, administration, and maintenance. That shouldn't necessarily, and that wouldn't make sense for that to be open sourced, right, necessarily. And in fact, the open source movement tends to run on the technology components, the operating system components, the base machine learning technology, the base blockchain technology, but where all the commercial value gets built is not there, but it's on top of that in terms of the application, and that is appropriate to be kept proprietary. So you have to go one level deeper on IP to really separate out what is valid to be kept as my proprietary software and what research technology, and largely for the universities, it's more at the lower levels, it's more fundamental, it's more enabling, and I believe that should be open sourced as much as possible.
Now, on the topic of open source, you talked about open data, and there are a couple of questions on open data which I'd like to pull together. One is issues of privacy, and the other is the reality of how likely is it that this reality will come to pass, particularly before commercialization. Would any of you like to speak to that? And then we'll come to you in a moment, sir.
No,
answer,
open data
yeah.
is happening. There's no doubt about it. It's growing. It actually creates a great research area, very secure anonymization, one-way methods, homomorphic encryption is a rich and wonderful research area. Many of the universities are jumping into it. So data can be opened up. Wonderful things can be done with open data, and it's happening. Obviously we have to protect privacy. That can also be done. Healthcare data can be suitably anonymized, with the right techniques.
Thank you. Sir, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. Neil Hernandez from Tecnológico de Monterrey in Mexico. So my question concerns the internationalization of IP. And let me explain a little bit. When you address medium to big company, they need solutions, not so you face the goal to address a solution. And for instance, an actual intelligent phone has around 100 patents, or hundreds of patents. So universities are have a lot of experience in internationalization of students, professors, and these kind of things. What about of dealing with, what are your comments in dealing with internationalization of IP? That means that sharing portfolios to address regional problems with a bigger portfolio of patents.
So if I can try to answer that, there are firms over the years that have done that, and some do it in the right ethical way, some do it in a less ethical way, where they try to pool patents together. The less ethical way is to put these patents together and then sell it to a industry or a company, and then you end up suing one another. And there are firms that does that, and there are firms who are doing it in a more ethical way. And I think what you just brought up is, again, my hypothetical vision that let's say there is a challenge to be approached. We have a problem we want to solve, and if that can be elevated up, and all the partner universities may have patents, may have companies in their ecosystem, may have faculty working on it, and then try to solve it. But what's going to bring all this together? Is it money? Is it a willingness to work together? So I think this is more of something we can all discuss and talk about, and maybe look at it from a slightly regional perspective. I mean, I'd like to look at logistics, for instance. We work with the Port Authority. They tell us that even if we can solve that logistics problem in Singapore, we can't get that easily over to Indonesia or to Netherlands, because every country has their own regulatory issues. So how do you streamline all this? Is it more patents? Is it more policies? Is it more companies coming in? Is it governments being in there? So I think it's an interesting challenge and opportunity at the same time to take a small global challenge to be solved by all partners. That's just a hypothetical vision. Yeah.
Right. We have just under 2 minutes left, so there's time perhaps for one or two last questions. There is one right in front here. Would you bring the microphone down? Is there another one around the room? Yes, over there, please. So in front here, first, third row.
Thank you. Xing Fang from the University of Melbourne. Would the panel be able to comment on, looking ahead in the next 30 years, how do you think this conversation between universities and industry will be different and shift from the current discussion? Thank you.
Perhaps we'll take the other question at the same time.
I'd be interested in your thoughts regarding the partnerships and collaborations that extend to not only industry, but to not-for-profits, government organizations, evidence-based research, social innovation, social cohesion, all the various issues that certainly drive economies and help build nations, and I'd be interested in hearing your perspectives on that.
Okay, thank you. Any last question around the room? If not, perhaps we'll invite the panelists to speak to one or both questions. Would you begin with Stephen?
Thank you. We could say so much about the last question, and I think it's really important in all of these conversations that we don't think that the only relevant partnerships are with industry, because really we're very focused, I think, in public benefit, which is one of the phrases I think, Bernd, you used earlier. So at Cambridge, for example, we have something, one of my favorite examples is something called the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, which is a collection of 9 world-leading conservation groups working in partnership on campus with our own conservation researchers, both in the social sciences and in the natural sciences. And I think they're just producing extraordinary work, for example, in protection of natural landscapes and notions of the natural economy, et cetera. So I think we really have to think about this as broadly as possible. On the question about where this is going, I'd like to tie that into an earlier question about the role that universities in perhaps less developed economies can play. I think where I would hope this is going to go is that we collectively as universities will become a bit more porous over time for all external organizations. And I think to make that happen, we have to understand how obtuse and difficult we are from an outsider's perspective. Our organizations are cumbersome. There's very little clear top-down leadership in most universities that would allow you to clearly identify exactly where things are happening across the university. So I think all of us, no matter what level of development, need to think about how, from an outsider's perspective, our universities could be made somewhat more transparent. How could you connect? Where might you connect? That seems to be part of our job, and if we could do that, I think we can expand relationships, partnerships dramatically over the course of the next 30 years.
Thank you. Other comments on either of the questions?
Yeah, I would like to emphasize the second question. That's of course very important for universities like the LMU. Funding by government agencies is far more important than funding by businesses. And for example, one very important partner for us is the European Union, and with many programs. And of course, we address issues like Stephen has mentioned them, and it's very clear that this is the main task of universities in many respects.
I just say it's very hard to predict what the problems on the table will be in 20 to 30 years, but I have a strong suspicion that they'll be about talent and the flow of talent. Wherever we are, at all times, it always seems we have a massive talent shortage, and this is particularly true in the STEM areas, science, technology, engineering, and math. Huge shortage. We're just not producing enough, even though there are lots of people choose this as number one in China and India. They choose those fields very low in most wealthy countries. And of course, that can be corrected with universities reaching out, universities globalizing, with more positive approaches to immigration, et cetera. All of those things can be dealt with, whether they will be or not. But I think talent will be a huge issue. And one of the particular challenges for the universities and industries and governments who will be expecting this, I quote from Tom Friedman, who has really been the high priest of globalization. And he talked about the movement of work from hand to head. This was the transition from manual work to work of knowledge workers, which could easily move around the world because of communication revolution. But he said, now it's different. It's changed again. It's from hand to head to heart. And in fact, AI will not take over everything. What will happen is the social issues and the ability for a doctor to be able to connect with a patient and change his behavior. That's the hard part. It's not actually coming up with the drug. It's changing that behavior. As we heard earlier, it's about understanding where the next cyber threat is going to come from, or where the next craze for retail purchases is going to come from. Understanding that relationship, and it doesn't mean creating a very middling person in the university who knows a bit about both. It requires people who know a lot about both, that have the skills to use AI tools and data science and math, and so on, to actually apply it. Majority of graduates, not just a few graduates, know how to apply those tools and especially be skeptical of the results of those tools, right? And yet at the same time have enough knowledge of the softer side of life that they can actually pull this together and start to solve the problems which came up, the societal problems, the problems that the NGOs and the governments around the world are trying to handle. I think that's probably going to be a big growing area. Not an easy one to solve because you're asking to change every person and every department in the university to change that. But I think if we can crack that, then we will make huge progress.
I've nothing more to add, but I just want to have one comment. I think every forum I go to, there's always a talk on IP and patents and all that. And I think it's important to have it, but I think we need to think about it that if you have it, you've got to make use of it, because patent isn't like good wines. It doesn't age very well. So that's my comment.
Thank you. So I'd like to say that we've had a very rich and engaging discussion, and I'm sure you like me, wish we had more time, but the clock is flashing, and we're already run out of time. So I'm not going to try and attempt a major summary at all, except to say very briefly that I think we've ranged across a number of areas that are of that strike at the heart of what a university is and how it is to work with its various stakeholder groups out there. The role of a university, first and foremost, is really to deliver that very good fundamental research, some of which will lead more immediately and sometimes in a much longer time frame to economic growth and societal benefit. But we don't start off necessarily by saying, what is this research that we do that will and must lead to economic benefit? It is also something to remember that universities are about educating the next generation. And even while we focus very much on the research side of the universities, the way in which we contribute to societal benefit and economic growth is actually very often through our students and the work that they do. We've talked very much about the challenges that confront that collaboration between industry, government, universities, ranging from issues to do with concentration effect and IP to questions of how to change, how to develop the talent and how to change the nature of universities and who populate universities. But we've also talked about the many opportunities and the upsides that come with the changes that we are facing today, from open data to open source possibilities through collaborations across universities in different jurisdictions, in different contexts, but also the need for change in universities so that that collaboration is much more possible, so that we're not that very complex, cumbersome organizations that external groups find very difficult to collaborate with.